Welcome to this Children in Northern Ireland professional briefing. My name is Ciaran Traynor, and this is one of a number of briefings to inform practice in the voluntary and community children and family services sector within Northern Ireland. The title of this briefing is, What is a Designated Officer? Let's think about the name. You may have heard of the Designated Child Protection Officer, or you may be working in an organisation that has a Designated Protection Officer, or a Designated Officer, or just a designated person. Maybe they're a safeguarding officer or manager, or maybe they're a designated safeguarding officer or a nominated safeguarding officer. Think about what the name is used in your organisation and in your child protection policy and your safeguarding policies and procedures. This is an important role. Think about the words used with regard to this title. It's designated. That means the person performing this role has responsibility from the organisation that has been delegated to them for protection and for safeguarding. The role is primarily about child protection. The key focus of the role is the safety of children and young people, and to ensure that the child protection and safeguarding procedures are followed within the organisation. Our law says the welfare of the child is paramount, and underpinning this role is this principle of paramountcy. In all decisions that the designated officer will make, the paramountcy of the child is important. They're often called an officer, and an officer is an important role. Someone who gives advice, makes decisions and judgments, and is a representative of the organisation. So the designated safeguarding role, the designated child protection officer, whatever they're called, they have a fundamental role in the safeguarding of children and young people within the organisation. Designated officers can be a part of a line manager's role. So the line manager may perform the role of designated officer. Or it could be a separately nominated person within the organisation outside of the line management hierarchy. It may be more than one person within the organisation to give the organisation spread in terms of geography and across projects. And there can be different levels of designated officer within the organisation. There may be designated officers who are close to the front line and maybe a supervising or a consultant designated officer. It will be important for you to familiarise yourself with who the designated officers are within your organisation, who is the person closest to your practice. Think about what's the situation in the organisation you're working in, or working for, or working within. If you're working in an organisation, for example, as a consultant, so you're not directly employed by that organisation, it will be the designated officer within that organisation that you would report to. Alternatively, I may be working in an organisation where I'm employed, so the designated officer would also be employed by that organisation. Some key roles and responsibilities of the designated officer. And it's important to say these are some of the key roles and responsibilities. There may be other roles and responsibilities as determined by particular organisations who have particular policies and procedures. Designated officers are there to provide information and advice on child protection within the organisation. So in effect, they could be the go-to person if you have a worry or a concern about a child protection issue. They have a responsibility to understand the policies and procedures in the organisation. So they have oversight of the policies and procedures and can guide decision-making with regard to child protection within the organisation. They have a role in ensuring child protection policies are up-to-date, accurate and fit for purpose. It would be very easy for a child protection policy in an organisation to become out of date if the designated officer is not reporting to the organisation on the efficacy of that policy. They should ensure the policies and procedures are followed. They may be the person who makes referral to social services or support other people to make referral to social services and or the police. And they should have an understanding of the needs of children in Northern Ireland process, what we call CiNI. CiNI, very simply, is a way of getting information from organisations to social services in a way that they can understand. And the designated officer should be familiar with that process and have access to the referral, the CiNI referral forms. Some other key roles and responsibilities. They should inform appropriate personnel within the organisation of any actions taken, so that organisations and senior management within organisations are aware of what the safeguarding issues within the organisation are. Ideally, they should establish contact and liaise with local social services team. It's always useful for a designated officer to have familiarity with who's on the local social services teams, people they can report to. It must be said that the closer we may work with social services, the more important that familiarity is. Designated officers should ensure information is available to social services. and that referrals to social services are followed up in writing. They should advise their organisation of the needs for child protection training. So designated officers will have a familiarity with how effective decision making with regard to child protection is within their organisation, and can advise the organisation of who needs trained, any changes in training, and adaptations to training that may make it more appropriate for the organisation and the challenges they and the service users face. They may ensure that accurate records are made and maintained correctly. Reporting and recording and good record keeping is a really important responsibility for child protection. The role of designated officers are a lot more straightforward if good records are kept within the organisation. And they may be involved in coordinating any action required within the organisation with regard to child protection or following a child protection process. And importantly, the role of the designated officer will include supporting and advising staff and service users. And to do that, they need to keep their knowledge up to date. If they are to be the key person with regard to child protection within the organisation, they need to have up-to-date knowledge. Designated officers will consider the child's welfare as paramount. In the role of designated officer, the person may be pulled in lots of different directions. They may have a loyalty to parents, a loyalty to the organisation, a loyalty to the community, but they have to consider the child's welfare as paramount. The tension that comes with loyalty may put designated officers in quite challenging situations, but a focus on the welfare of the child is really important to help us make effective decisions. Designated officers will make sure the policies and procedures are followed. The further we move away from the decision-making process and our policies and procedures, the more risk we take as individuals. The closer we stay to our organisation policies and procedures, the safer we will be, and the more likely it will be that we will be protected by the organisation. Designated officers will gather information in order to share that information with social services when appropriate, but they will not investigate. It is important to remember that those of us who work within the voluntary and community sector do not have a role in investigating child abuse. Designated officers will not decide that abuse has happened, is happening, or may happening. It is not their responsibility to decide. It is the designated officer's responsibility with us to share information with social services who will investigate, and they will decide in concert with the police and courts whether child abuse has happened, is happening, or will happen. Designated officers will offer advice on next steps. So as I said before, they are the go-to person when we want to know what happens or what will happen or to get advice on what will happen. They will provide and share information when there are concerns. So designated officers can provide and share information with us, or they can provide and share information with social services or the police with the focus on the welfare of the child. And they will cooperate in statutory processes and enable the organisation and staff members within that organisation to participate and cooperate in statutory processes. And they will support colleagues and support service users. They are the person who can offer advice within the organisation on child welfare and child protection issues. Most organisations working with children and families in Northern Ireland will have a child protection process. This is a basic child protection escalation process. And by escalation, it means that information can be escalated from the point of contact with the child through to a process where it may involve social services and the police. It's almost like climbing a series of steps where thresholds of concern are met. So very basically, if a worker has a concern, they can share that concern with the designated officer. And if the designated officer supports that concern and considers that concern to be serious, i.e. to have met the threshold to report to the next stage, they may consult with the Health and Social Services Trust and the social worker within, or they may consult or report to the police. That then may result in a formal referral or indeed an adaptation to our plans to take account of the welfare issue. So this process is relatively straightforward, but it is quite complex. If a staff member has a concern and takes it to the designated officer, there may be a conversation going back and forward as the designated officer seeks to verify information, collect information, gather information, or advise the staff member on what to do. So the designated officer may decide that information does not meet the threshold to go to the next stage, to go to social services, but that decisions are made between the designator and the staff member about what to do next. There may also be a conversation between the designated officer and social services about what to do next, which may happen over time. So this process is relatively straightforward, but it is complex because it involves individuals and it involves thresholds of need and risk. In the event of an emergency, it is very important that we act in the best interest of the child And that may require us to put the process to one side in the best interest of the child. So if a child was about to be abducted from a project or a crime was in process, it will be important that we don't call our designated officer, but we seek to protect the child, and then we let our designated officer know what has happened. The designated officer will want to know why you think this is a concern. Is your concern because of a suspicion you have? Has an allegation been made? Has someone witnessed something? Has something been disclosed? Has a child or parent or someone else disclosed something to you? Is this concern to do with need? This child's needs are not being met? Or is it to do with a risk the child is facing? Is it something to do with harm that has happened, is happening, or could happen? Maybe this is a one-off concern that you have, or maybe it's a pattern of concerns. Is it something that has been done? Something that an act that has been committed that has affected the child? Or is it something that hasn't been done that should have been done? An act of omission, for example, omitting to give a child medication. So what is the basis of the concern? Maybe there are other things that you can think of that would cause concern that should be reported to a designated officer. So a designated officer will want to know where the concern is coming from and why this is a concern. So if we go to our designated officers, having that information to hand will be really useful. To help in decision-making within the child protection process or the escalation process, the designated officer will want to know if there is information or concerns about 3 general areas. The parent or carer's capacity, their ability to provide basic care and to ensure the safety of the child, their emotional warmth, the guidance, the boundaries, the stimulation shown, and the general stability in the parent-child relationship. They may also want to know about child's needs, the child's health and development, their education and learning, their identity, self-esteem, and ability to self-care and look after themselves, and things to do with the family and social relationships. The third area, or the third domain, are issues to do with the family and environment, the wider family and environment. So do you have information about family history, functioning, and well-being? Do you have information about the extended family and resources within the general social networks and community? Is there information about housing, employment, and income that might be relevant? These are the 3 elements or the 3 domains of the unit CiNI framework. You may not have information on all of these areas. It depends on your role, but you may have information on some of this, which might be relevant to the decision-making process that you and the designated officer will enter into. Designated officers will also want to know what the concern is related to. Is it related to physical abuse? Has a child been deliberately physically harmed? Or neglect? The child's physical, intellectual, emotional, and social needs are not being met. Or is it to do with sexual abuse, the involvement of a child in age-inappropriate sexual activity? Is it emotional or psychological abuse of a child, the undermining of a child's sense of self and well-being? Or is it exploitation, a child being taken advantage of, someone seeking gain at the expense of a child, or some combination of those? As said earlier, it is not our role in the voluntary and community sector can conclude that abuse has, is, or may happen, though we may have concerns about these welfare issues. So a designated officer may have concerns about the physical abuse of a child, but it's not their role to determine that abuse has happened. Designated officers will also want to know where the concern is coming from. So what's the basis of the concern? What does the concern involve? And where is it coming from? Is it something that we've been told? Something we've seen? Something we've read, maybe going back through our files? Something we have heard, or indeed something we've smelt? Or is it sense, intuition, gut feeling? We need to be careful about gut feeling. As far as possible, decisions with regard to a child's welfare should be based on tangible information. If we have a gut feeling, there may be a basis for that gut feeling. So it should be important for us to think about, is the gut feeling or the intuition coming from something I have seen or heard or smelt or witnessed, but my subconscious is registering it as intuition? It's very hard for a designated officer or a social worker to act on intuition. So think about, where is your gut feeling coming from? And with regard to the source of information, the voice, views, and opinions of the child are really important. So what's the voice of the child? What can you bring to the designated officer that highlights the voice of the child? Designated officers will also want to know who's involved and any relevant characteristics known about the people involved. So if you consider the people involved in a child's life, the child themselves, their siblings, parents, carers, grandparents, people in the community, friends, peers, teachers, do we have names, addresses, ages? What's the involvement of these people in our services or other services? Are there disabilities? Are there mental health issues? Are there issues to do with criminality, domestic abuse, substance use? Or are there other things that are relevant characteristics to do with these individuals that the designated officer will want to know? The designated officer will also want to know why this concern is serious or significant. So some things to think about in terms of significance. Is what's happening to this child unreasonable, not what would be expected or wanted for a child? And why might that be the case? What can we communicate to the designated officer that might lead them to agree with us that this is unreasonable? Are we talking about something that is serious, severe, that is of sufficient degree, intensity, and extent that it causes us concern, that it goes on for a long time or is frequent enough to cause harm? What's the impact on the health and well-being of the child that we may know that we can communicate to the designated officer? Do we know anything about intention, premeditation, etc., that would be relevant? Is there substance involved, alcohol, drugs, licit or illicit drug? Is there a history that we're aware of that might be relevant to the information we share with the designated officer? And is there urgency? There may be other important information that you can think of that would go into your sharing of information with the designated officer. So when we have a concern and we think about, we know where that concern comes from, why it is serious, the people involved in the concern, and we share that information with our designated officer, then they will decide what happens next. And it may be that we deal with it within our projects or in our services because it doesn't meet the referral threshold to go to the next stage. Or maybe the designated officer says that we need to consult with social services, or that consultation results in a formal referral to social services. The designated officer, on their own or with us, depending on what your child protection policy will say, will use the CiNI referral process to communicate information to social services. And when referring, designated officers will want to communicate. To support them in their role, designated officers need to know who supports them. Where do their supports come from? It can be a challenging role where the designated officer may be pulled in a number of different directions. So who is supporting the designated officer? Where does their support come from? And also, who do they report to in the organization to ensure that organizational management is up to date on the safeguarding picture within the organization? If designated officers are dealing with concerns coming from staff members, but they don't share the information coming from those concerns with management, there can be a disconnect between the management of the organization and operational practice within the organization. Designated officers need to know how they keep their training and knowledge up to date. The situation in child welfare, child protection can move very quickly, and the Safeguarding Board in Northern Ireland are always undertaking case management reviews to inform our practice. So it's important that designated officers keep their knowledge up to date so that they can advise the staff and the organisation about current practice and current welfare issues. Designated officers also need to know who to talk to ensure that the organisation's child protection policy and procedures are up to date. Who owns the child protection policy within the organisation? Who is responsible for keeping it up to date? It may be the designated officer or designated officers, but if it's someone else, designated officers need to be sharing information with them to ensure that the policy reflects the complexities of practice within the organisation. Designated officers also need to know where the contacts and the networks are outside of the organisation. So on this slide in front of us, we have the phone numbers for the key trusts, the regional emergency social work service, what is the out of hours service, the police service, and then a series of other resources that may be useful for the designated officer or to share with staff members and service users. Click CiUp is the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Team. They're part of the National Crime Agency. And if we Google CiUp, and that button will appear on the screen, the Click CiUp button, and we push that button, it allows us to make a referral to the National Crime Agency, and that's primarily to do with online child protection issues. For more information regarding the role of the designated officer and other child protection issues, we can access the regional procedures, and these can be accessed through the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland website, www.proceduresonline.com/SBNI/. We hope you got a lot out of this briefing. If you have any questions or concerns about the role of designated officer, then please come along to our designated officer training. You can check out details of the next training events on the Children in Northern Ireland website, or check out further briefings, for example, on what is child abuse, what is unit CiNI. We will be posting these briefings and keeping our information up to date to inform children's services within Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.